Warning: the following presentation is intended for mature audiences and it contains graphic descriptions of crime scenes, adult dialogue, and strong language. This podcast represents the opinions of the hosts and their guests, and every effort is made to ensure that information is accurate. Viewer discretion is advised. Welcome, fellow armchair detectives. I'm your host, Ashleigh.
And I'm your host, Tamlyn Rossouw.
And this is Just in Crime. Join us as we explore the issue of gender-based violence and femicide in South Africa
by exploring the victims and their stories.
The Fairhead family lived a really beautiful life that was filled with great potential. With Kai being only 11 and both parents having made a name for themselves in the South African business world, their life had so many experiences and memories that they would share together. However, after a weekend of celebration and a fishing trip that goes fatally wrong, those dreams and experiences are brought to a grinding halt. This is the case of Kia and Brenda Fairhead. So just some background to the family. The family basically consists of Brenda, Nigel, their father, their daughter Vashti, who is Nigel's daughter from their first marriage. And she's 27. And then little Kai, who is only 11 years old. So just into the family history, their father Nigel, he basically is like a really skinny guy. He has a crispy gray crew cut. And he came to South Africa when he was 2.5. His family settled in East London and he went to school in Grahamstown. He first met Brenda in 1976 when he had just started his company, Fairheads, which was basically like a shoe and like sandal business, very hippie-ish, but really popular at the time. Brenda was an Australian nurse who could be described as like tall, long-legged, really beautiful and super eccentric. She was very glamorous and she always wore bright colors such as red and orange because she absolutely just adored the autumn colors. She was a powerful woman and was often described as like a force to be reckoned with. And when I picture her, I literally just think of like a firecracker of a person who just has this like incredible capacity to embrace life. So she was in South Africa and she had actually had plans to go up to Kenya, but as soon as she met Nigel, all those plans were like put on hold. Nigel was a hatha yoga teacher at the time, and Brenda basically walked into his class and it was love at first sight. Their relationship was filled with passion, and from the start they were very, very like powerful feelings. They truly, truly loved each other. The couple started running the business together and Brenda ended up taking care of like all the stores while Nigel handled the manufacturing side of things. Their teamwork paid off and their business grew from a small hippie sandal shop to basically like a massive financial success. The two of them eventually decided to grow their family, and that's when they had their little girl, Kia. So, Kia was described as, like I said, a really, really little girl, and she attended Waldorf School in Constantia. Now, I've seen the Waldorf School in like Johannesburg, and I don't know, the kids from there are just great, really well behaved. It's a really nice private school, also really small. And she was basically described as everyone as being like really proud, and as much as she would hang out with the other kids that were her age, she had a very like mature quality about her. She would essentially like strut into class with like her head held high and do like that typical girl thing where we like flick our hair. And in all honesty, she was just becoming a mini version of her mother. And basically they had the same qualities, which wasn't surprising at all considering how close the family was. So the house that the family stayed in could be described as one of those 70s architectural experiments that belongs to the vogue of bringing like the outside in. The design resembles like a large greenhouse where huge shrubs with glossy, leathery leaves beat up against the plate glass windows. And it basically like cast a green light into the interior. So it's fair to say that their house was really, really nice. They lived a very lavish life. And I think it was just a good experience being there. So, fast forward to the weekend of the 14th of January 2000. The family had made their way to Kleinmonde Cottage in the Eastern Cape as they were attending a close relative's wedding there. The wedding was really beautiful and very festive, and there was just an atmosphere that was filled with like celebration and happiness. On the 17th, the day after the wedding, Brenda and Kia had decided to go fishing. Her father had decided he was going to stay home, and he was really tired from like the festivities that took place the night before, and there was also a really long drive back home the next morning, so I guess he just wanted to chill. He also really wasn't concerned about it being just the two of them, as it was a really good time of year to go fishing, as it was peak summer, so it didn't get dark until late. And also, it wasn't like it was an isolated place, and they had been there many times before, so everyone assumed like, hey, this is pretty safe. He helped them get set up and pack everything before they left. And there was actually like a moment right before they left where he had changed his mind. But by the time he had called out for them and ran to the bottom of the gate, they had already left. The two of them went to Fish River, and they actually had like a very, very successful fishing trip. They got to spend the day amongst the beautiful scenery under the sun. Kia actually managed to catch 2 fish, which she was like really, really excited about. And she called her dad to tell her like, hey, this has happened. We're going to be leaving soon, and we have these fish for dinner. Unfortunately, though, they would never make it home. The 2 ladies at the time were unaware that they had been being watched for a while. Close by sat 3 young men who waited for them to return to their car so they could rob them. As Kia reached for the car, the youngest boy grabbed Kia. Brenda obviously saw this and was in such a state of shock that she fell to the ground. It was at this point that the other men tied her hands and feet with a t-shirt and then fastened it with their belt. They forced Kia into the front seat of the car, and there was a moment where Brenda actually managed to set herself free, but she was easily overpowered and shoved in between the front and back seat and drove away. As they were driving, the 3 men spoke of what they should do next, and basically they were like, no, we should leave them on the side of the road and just take the car. Kia obviously understood a little bit of what they were saying. They were speaking in Sotho, and she started to plead for her and her mother's life in broken Sotho, basically saying like, yes, do that. Please leave us on the side of the road. Like, take the car. Like, just leave us alive. However, the men would eventually pull over and cut a hand towel into strips. I think this was so that they could tie them up. They then pulled Brenda down to a steep embankment while the youngest boy stayed in the car with Kia. The 2 other men took Brenda down to the bottom, and it was there that a brutal attack would take place. They first tried to incapacitate Brenda by hitting her in the head. When she did not die, they then strangled her, and they used such brutal force that they had actually fractured her tongue bone. Brenda, surprisingly, was still alive, and she continued to fight. They then tried to strangle her once again, and once she appeared to be dead, they stopped. One of the men made his way back to the car and told the youngest boy to take Kia down to where the mother was laying and rape her. As the young boy made his way down to the embankment, he saw Brenda basically standing up and falling down, and he immediately ran back to the car to tell his partner. He then gave the young boy a knife and told him to take it down to the other man and give him the instruction to slit her throat. Apparently, there was some back and forth between the men about who was actually going to do it, and long story short, it resulted in them stabbing Brenda directly in the heart. They then moved on to Kia, who they strangled. As the hours passed and there was no word from Brenda or Kia, Nigel realized that something had gone very wrong. This was super strange because remember, as I mentioned earlier, Kia had called her father really excited about the 2 fish that she had just brought and that she was going to bring home for dinner. When they didn't return, he immediately contacted some relatives and they all formed their own little search party and looked around the river and surrounding areas. Unfortunately, they couldn't find anything. However, 24 hours later, their battered bodies were found in a deep ravine in the Kieskama Pass. The hijacked vehicle, a blue Peugeot, was found in the Frankfurt area. So, unfortunately, when I was researching the case, I was not able to find any information about how they arrested the boys or managed to locate where they were. But when I thought about it, I thought it was pretty obvious. Like, they stole a whole car. And with technology and cameras and stuff, they could have easily just done a roadblock in the surrounding areas and looked for a stolen Peugeot, and they would have found the boys. They also found on the arrest that the boys were quite young. And so I'm sure that their plan wasn't well executed and that they would leave several clues and evidence that would link them to the crime. Also, keep in mind, if any of these boys had had previous run-ins with the police, they would have been able to run their fingerprints at the crime scene and through the system to help find who they were looking for. Nonetheless, they were able to find the 3 boys who had committed this horrible crime.
Before we jump into the investigation, be sure to check us out on Instagram and Facebook at Just in Crime SA for more episodes, case-related content, updates, and other riveting content.
Also keep in mind, we are not professionals in any of the discussed fields. If you or anyone you know is in danger, you can find resources on our social media pages, or alternatively, you can contact the Gender-Based Violence Command Center at 0800 428 428 or SMS HELP to 31531. The 3 boys accused of the murder were identified as brothers Bongani and Zolani Tom, both aged 22, and their 17-year-old nephew, whose name cannot be mentioned as he was a minor when the incident took place. The Tom brothers and the young boy were facing charges of murder, rape, indecent assault, and robbery with aggravated circumstances. All 3 boys were to appear in the Port Alfred Magistrates Court, and they all pleaded not guilty to all charges. So just something I wanted to throw in is, due to the family being really well known in Grahamstown, obviously because of their really successful business, they actually had to fly a judge down from Gauteng to basically proceed with the case, as he wouldn't have any prejudices or a biased opinion. So when the first court hearing came around, the 3 boys strutted through the courtroom, coldly staring down the family members of the Fairhead family as if they had done anything wrong, and swearing at journalists and making just rude and inappropriate signs. However, their attitude started to change as the gory details of what happened that day started to come out, and the 3 of them eventually started to turn on each other. It was essentially the minor who really gave away most of the information and essentially painted a full picture of what happened that day. However, Bongani and Zolani stood by their story that they had never done anything to either Brenda or Kia that day. The prosecution explained how Brenda had fought so hard for her life that the skin, which was later traced back to Bongani, was found underneath her fingernails, and how she was so brutally injured that she sustained at least 36 injuries. When they looked further into the case, they tried to unravel what had happened to these 2 victims, and so they basically conducted vaginal smears for semen for both Brenda and Kia, and they both came out negative. So while they were able to conclude that Kia was not raped, they could not be sure if the same was for Brenda. Also keep in mind that just because there wasn't semen present does not eradicate the theory that she could have been raped or sexually assaulted, as rape can sometimes take place with the use of other objects or other body parts.
So basically sodomizing.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's where that indecent assault charge came in, because they couldn't be rape for Kia, but they could say indecent assault.
Yes.
So, throughout the proceedings, the three boys were unable to show like a true understanding of the gravity of what had taken place or shown any remorse for the pain and suffering that they'd caused to both the victims and their families. A witness who is the uncle of the three boys had said that the three boys basically arrived at his house in the hijacked luxury Peugeot hours after the killing took place at about 3 a.m. The three had woken him up with a knock on the door, and this was like fairly normal. When their uncle questioned them about the keys in his hand, Bongani Tom told him that it was his father's car. The next morning, the three of them cruised around in the Peugeot, buying liquor, food, cigarettes. This behavior was like described as being carefree, except for one incident, which is when I assume they got arrested. A helicopter flew over them and Zolani kind of disappeared running down the street, and Bongani and the younger boy sped away in his car. Hearing of the brutality that took place during this case was really, really hard for her father. This sensitive situation was then made worse. There was basically picture evidence of the bottled bodies of Brenda and Kia that was used like in the courtroom. These images were then used by the SABC, which is obviously like one of our biggest broadcasting channels. And basically they used those images while reporting on the news, like what happened with this case. This is completely and totally out of line, and like it really, really hurt Nigel, who's Kia's father, as like not only is he now having to sit the whole day and listen to how like his loved ones suffered and see these images, but then he goes home and he turns on the news and he sees it being broadcasted to the entire country, and honestly it's just too much for him. The rest of the country also felt that this was like way inappropriate, and many complaints were written to like the Broadcasting Complaints Commission of South Africa, so the BCCSA.
Oh, dude, this is clearly just another case where the media is overstepping their boundaries completely and just exploiting suffering for like entertainment value and just selling a headline.
Yeah, dude. And this made the court proceedings even more like emotional than it was. And there was actually like one thing that was said was Nigel Fairhead displayed like such composure throughout the entire case, regardless of all these emotions that he must have been going through, that it really like struck a chord of sympathy for those around him and within the community. There was also this really, really emotional scene that took place on the last day of court when the mother of the 17-year-old youth basically apologized to him on her son's behalf with like tears in her eyes. In this case, we were lucky enough that the justice system worked in like our favor and in the favor of the victim and their family, and the Port Alfred Magistrate Court handed down life sentences to the three of the accused. So that's that for this case. What did you think, dude?
I think this was a very, very hectic case, as most of our cases are. But I just wanted to clarify, what exactly was the motive behind it, wanting like to kill these two women?
Oh, no, there was absolutely no motive. They had no intention to. It was actually intended to only be a robbery. And I think it was Zolani. He was like, no, we're just going to rob them. We're just going to rob them, right? And he was the one who's also like, we should leave them on the side of the road. And I have no idea how we went from stealing these people's car to murdering them.
Exactly, dude. Like, again, we're seeing that thing with the cases, whether it's an intimate partner or whether it's a random person, just the absolute, like, escalation in the severity of the situation. Like, it's absolutely outrageous.
Yeah, and also what struck me was when I was researching this case, remember how I was saying there was some back and forth between the guys being like, you need to go kill Brenda.
Yeah.
Basically, their reasoning that was stated in court behind this back and forth was Zolani basically didn't want to slit her throat like she was some sort of animal. But for me, I don't see how what they did was any better.
So, like, literally, for what? What is the reason? A joyride and a cigarette? Like, what is the reason?
Like, literally, they did it so that they could ride around in a fancy car for one day. And dude, it's again that conversation on how can a random stranger possess such anger to execute such violent crimes against women that they don't know?
Like, dude, it's like it goes over my head. Like, it's so wild for me. They didn't even know them. And in that sense, I kind of think of it's similar like to Unene's case, where it was a stranger and just the dramatic escalation and like the ridiculously high levels of brutality.
So yeah, with this, we're clearly seeing like the recipe for classic South African like femicide case. And I feel like I just want to end this episode by asking our listeners, like, what do you think needs to get done to get a hold of this issue? We've obviously discussed from a government perspective and creating a bottom to bottom plan in previous episodes. However, I think it's really good to hear from you, the listeners, as we feel like obviously these situations affect like the women in this country like the most. So I'm going to encourage you to leave your thoughts and opinions on our social media pages. But with that being said, that's it for today's case.
Thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode. Be sure to check out our social media for more episodes, case-related content, and other riveting info.
We'd also like to give a massive shout out to Christian Putter for creating our theme song. Be sure to check out more of his work on Instagram at Christian_Putter.
And then we would also just like to thank Anthony Catano for creating our album art. So be sure to follow him at @Catano on Instagram.
And lastly, we'd like to give a huge shout out to VU Media for helping produce this podcast. Be sure to follow them on Facebook and Insta at VU_Media SA.